Washington is well regarded as one of the greatest men in history, but he should also be remembered as one of the greatest horsemen of all time. Thomas Jefferson is quoted with saying of Washington, he was the best horseman of his age, and the most graceful figure that can be seen on horseback. Hello and welcome back to 17th and 18th century horsemanship. This time I'm going to cover Washington's horses, the different mounts he had in battle, and the different mounts he had as president, and so on and so forth, because he was also a farmer of horses as well. So, to get started, I found a census that Washington wrote of all the horses on his estate in 1786. Most were farm horses. He by then had 5 farms around his Mount Vernon mansion. And this list records several of the horses, as well as their occupations, maybe their ages and their sizes too. These horses were either for riding or farming, and also wagon driving. Now I'll be discussing 5 of these horses, as they were the most famous and well-known of the horses from his lifetime. Using the timeline of his spurs, this first pair being from the war, and the second highlighting his presidency, I'll list each horse in the chronological order that he had them. Regarding the first pair, Washington used those spurs in battle and on campaign in the earliest years of the war. Research tells us that Washington's prominent horse was Blueskin. Blueskin was an Arabian, or an Arabian cross, a half-breed. He was a gelding, with a white and grayish coat that gave off an almost blue sheen. Now, Arabians have a reputation for being hot horses, which is a term used to describe different and basic horse bloodlines and their subsequent behaviors. This means that they were athletic, usually with excess energy. This also means that Blueskin was, and I quote, a good charger, good for running into battles. However, often hot horses are subsequently also skittish, usually. Not always, but usually. Well, Blueskin possessed this personality. Well, he may have been good at running into battle, and apparently looked good doing it. When it came to standing around and withstanding the sounds of battle, he was a little jumpy. This was obviously not ideal in a war horse. Now, some horses are naturally a little braver in areas than others, and vice versa, but apparently Blueskin did not easily tolerate the sights, sounds, and smells of battle, as steadily as Washington would have liked. Because of this, Washington possibly had another horse that he also rode at the time, so as to give Blueskin a break sometimes, pending further discovery. But Blueskin is usually the horse who is portrayed with Washington in his paintings and portraits. This is because his looks and his appearance were almost beautiful, pristine, as a white horse that Washington was riding. Now, as far as horse coat colors go, he was defined as a gray, which means he had black skin with white fur, and usually that white fur gets even whiter as the horse ages. It's possible that Blueskin was the horse that carried Washington into many, if not most, of his battles in the war prior to 1778. Blueskin seems to have been sold or given as a gift to George Washington by a Colonel Benjamin Dulany and his wife, Elizabeth French Dulany. Now, Washington had been the ward to Elizabeth French when she was young, and he had even given her away at her wedding to Benjamin in 1773. So there was a sweet relation between the family. And Benjamin had given Blueskin as a gift to Washington shortly after. Interestingly, after the war, George Washington gave Blueskin back to Elizabeth French as a gift late in 1785, presenting the horse to her, stating in a letter, "The marks of antiquity have supplied the place where those beauties with which this horse unaboundedly had in his young age. Nothing but the recollection of which, and his having been the favorite of Mr. Dulany, her husband, in the days of his courtship, can reconcile her to the meager appearance he now makes." What this means is now Blueskin was ready to retire. Only the fond memories of his once gorgeous appearance can be remembered. For us, that will be remembered forever, even more than that generation, because Blueskin's image is everywhere. So Blueskin was put out to pasture, living out the last of his days comfortably, as a sort of horse celebrity, as people would come to see him as the horse that Washington rode in the war. Now, to the next horse in Washington's life is the most well-regarded horse that Washington ever rode. He was a chestnut gelding, meaning he was light reddish and brown in color. Standing at 16 hands high, this horse carried Washington throughout the rest of the war, along with Blueskin. This horse is Nelson. In fact, once you study George Washington and his horses, the first name to come up will almost always be Nelson. Washington loved this horse. His life had depended on him. And Nelson came into Washington's life in the summer of 1778, just after Washington had gave away his first pair of spurs to Lieutenant Thomas Lamb. Washington, according to his diaries, was in need of a good horse other than Blueskin. This reached the ears of a brigadier general named Thomas Nelson, Jr. This Virginia military man was insistent that he give away his own horse, which was the chestnut, to George Washington. In a letter of thanks, Washington at first states his uncertainty of depriving General Nelson with his favorite horse by saying, "You have pressed me once, nay twice, to accept him as a gift. As a proof of my sincere attachment and friendship for you, I obey, with the assurance that from none but a gentleman whom I have the highest regard would I do this, notwithstanding the distressed situation I have been in for need of wanting one." And thus, the chestnut was sent to Washington, who was stationed in White Plains, New York at the time. And in another sign of gratitude, Washington named the sweet gelding Nelson, in honor of his former owner, the Brigadier General. So the result is that the horse Nelson became infinitely more famous than the man he is named after. What's interesting is that Nelson, the horse, was fairly middle-aged at this time, in horse years. He was around 15 years old, which in horse years puts him around maybe his 40s or 50s. Coincidentally, the same age as Washington. And age was not an issue. Nelson was a terrific horse. Where Blueskin struggled with the horrors of war, Nelson took to it with ease. Washington was not disappointed, and he quickly became Washington's favorite mount. Nelson would carry Washington into the rest of the greatest battles of the war, including the famous victory at Yorktown in 1781. Until at last the war came to its conclusion with the British evacuation of New York in October 1783. Once and for all, the British were defeated, and the United States was at last made independent. Washington took Nelson home to Mount Vernon, where he and his horse would at last comfortably retire for the rest of their days. Now, Washington's retirement would be cut short, of course, because the new nation needed a president. But Nelson would live out the rest of his days in comfort, out to pasture, yet again, like Blueskin, a sort of wartime celebrity, as visitors to Mount Vernon would want to see the horse that carried Washington through the war. Therefore, I'll talk next about Washington's presidential horses. Washington had a great many horses bought, purchased, that he rode, and that he kept at his Mount Vernon estate during his presidency, which was in the 1780s and 90s. But there were two horses that stand out, Prescott and Jackson. These were both pure white horses, and Washington rode them on an alternating basis as president. Now, Prescott is the one I'll focus on. He's perhaps the more famous of the two, having taken General Washington, now President Washington, on various parades and travels across the country. He also took Washington throughout New York City around his presidential quarters. Washington bought Prescott in 1789, when the horse was around 10 years old. This places Prescott's birth date around 1778. After buying him, the first journey that the two took was from Mount Vernon to New York City for Washington's inauguration in 1789. According to the reports, his step-grandson, George Washington Parke Custis, Prescott was, and I quote, generally indifferent to the firing of artillery and the waving of banners and the clang of martial instruments. This meant Prescott was an ideal horse for parades. Though apparently he had something against wagons, because Prescott would, and I quote, have a very bad habit of dancing about on the approach of a carriage. Now this characteristic made Prescott ill-suited to pulling carriages and wagons, which was typically what you could do with riding horses. You could ride them and you could also pull them in a carriage. But Prescott wasn't keen on this, so Washington was happy using him as just a riding horse. Washington rode Prescott most during his tours across all the states of the new country. For instance, when he traveled through the southern states in 1792. And everywhere he went, he and Prescott were both greeted by huge crowds of ecstatic citizens. Thank heavens Prescott was kept clean and white every single night. And this happened upon arriving in every town. Between towns and parades, Washington would sometimes ride in a coach. While he was in a coach, one of his greatest horsemen, I believe it was either Paris or Giles, would ride Prescott on the side. Well, all of this traveling was naturally hard on the horses, and Washington often lamented, and I quote, "The abominably heavy and sandy road left his horses much worn out." Thus were the almost daily worries of every horse owner of the 18th century. I'll finish this discussion on Washington's horses by highlighting two more horses that he had at the very end of his life. One of them was a chestnut Arabian, Magnolia. Standing at about 16 hands tall, Magnolia, or Magnolio as he was also called, was a stallion racehorse. Magnolia was a full-blooded Arabian, unlike Blueskin, who was a half-breed. Washington had bought him for 500 pounds from the estate of John Parke Custis, who was his stepson. That young man had unfortunately died in 1781 at the age of 26, but he left behind an estate, including this stunning Arabian, who had a talent for speed. He was a 5-year-old horse, which was a prime age for a racehorse, and he is recorded by Washington as flawless. Now Magnolia had been a successful racehorse in Alexandria, which was the nearest port city some 9 miles from Mount Vernon. As a result, the stallion became rather famous and was in high demand. Washington would occasionally direct his farm manager to advertise or exhibit Magnolia during public events, like fairs. Lastly, the horse I'll mention is Traveler. Washington bought him in 1798, which was just around when he opened his distillery. Now, Traveler is described as a full-blooded dark bay horse. He would be used as a breeding stallion for Washington's farm. Washington wrote a letter before he bought Traveler, stating, "Since writing to you yesterday, I have bought a handsome horse." Washington reportedly paid $200 to a Mr. A.P. Morris for a stud horse, which was Traveler. He was brought to Washington's estate and put up as a stud. Now this story is good to highlight because it shows more to Washington as a dexterous horseman, far more than just war, the presidency, or even fox hunting, because he did not really consider himself by those things absolute, more than he considered himself a farmer. In fact, above all, that's how he wanted to be remembered, was as a farmer. The majority of his horses were as workers on his farms, and after he switches from tobacco to wheat on his estate, which he did in his mid-30s, he needed more horse labor and less manual labor. Because horses are needed to plow the fields for wheat seeds, whereas tobacco needed man-made hands and people to carefully plant the seed in the ground. So Washington was always carefully considering the proliferation and care of horses on his farms. You can always think of him as Washington the Horseman, beyond just riding them for war or as the president. And that concludes the second chapter of studying George Washington's spurs, him as a horseman. Next week, I'm going to have one last video studying these spurs, where I'll be highlighting one of the most brilliant men that rode with him, William Lee. Thanks for watching.